Before we begin this incredible true story, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so you never miss another heartwarming story like this. 1. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard outside Buckingham Palace. James Mitchell stood perfectly still in his crimson uniform, his tall bearskin hat adding to his already impressive height. He had been a royal guard for 3 years now, and the job had become second nature to him. Tourists gathered around, snapping photos and occasionally trying to make him laugh or move. James remained motionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead. Just as he had been trained, it was a typical Tuesday morning in London. The streets were bustling with activity as locals hurried to work and tourists explored the historic landmarks. James had taken his post at 6 in the morning, and he still had several hours to go before his shift ended. The weather was pleasant, with a gentle breeze that provided some relief from standing in the heavy uniform. Among the crowd that morning was Officer Derek Thompson, a police officer who had been having a particularly bad week. His marriage was falling apart. He had been passed over for a promotion, and his supervisor had reprimanded him the day before for arriving late to work. Derek was angry at the world, and he was looking for someone to take out his frustrations on. As Derek walked past the palace, he noticed the royal guards standing at their posts. Something about their stillness, their discipline, their unwavering focus irritated him. He stopped and stared at James, who continued to look straight ahead. Completely ignoring the police officer's presence, Derek moved closer. Standing directly in front of James, he waved his hand in front of the guard's face, trying to get a reaction. James remained perfectly still, his training kicking in. The royal guards were taught to ignore all distractions, no matter how annoying or intrusive they might be. This only made Derek angrier. He felt disrespected, as though this guard was looking down on him. In his mind, he was a police officer, someone who deserved respect and acknowledgement. The fact that James was ignoring him felt like a personal insult. Several tourists nearby started to notice the interaction. Some pulled out their phones, sensing that something unusual was about to happen. The atmosphere around the palace entrance began to shift from cheerful curiosity to uncomfortable tension. Derek stepped even closer to James, now standing just inches from his face. He began to speak in a low, threatening voice, using words that would have made most people step back or respond. But James remained frozen, his eyes never wavering from their fixed position straight ahead. Sweat began to form on his brow, not from the heat, but from the effort of maintaining his composure. The police officer's frustration reached a boiling point. In a moment of poor judgment that would change both their lives forever, Derek raised his hand and shoved James hard in the chest. The force of the push caused James to stumble backward slightly, though he quickly regained his footing and returned to his position. The crowd gasped. Several people shouted in protest. Cameras were now recording from multiple angles, capturing every moment of the shocking scene. A police officer assaulting a royal guard on duty was unthinkable, yet here it was, happening in broad daylight in front of dozens of witnesses. Derek realized immediately that he had made a terrible mistake. The anger that had consumed him just moments before was now replaced by a cold wave of fear. He looked around at the crowd, at the phones pointed in his direction, at the other guards who had witnessed the assault. His face went pale as the reality of what he had done began to sink in. James, despite having been physically assaulted, maintained his position. His jaw was clenched, his fists tight at his sides, but he did not break protocol. He did not retaliate. He did not even look at Derek. He simply stood there, demonstrating a level of self-control that few people possess. Within moments, other officers from the Metropolitan Police arrived on the scene. They had been alerted by witnesses and by the palace security who had seen the incident on their monitors. Derek was quickly surrounded by his fellow officers, their faces showing a mixture of shock and disappointment. The supervisor on duty, Sergeant Williams, approached Derek with a stern expression. He asked Derek to explain himself, but the officer had no explanation that could justify what he had done. The evidence was overwhelming, recorded on multiple devices by tourists who had witnessed the entire incident. Derek was immediately escorted away from the palace grounds. His police radio and badge were taken from him on the spot as part of standard procedure. When an officer is involved in a serious incident, he was placed in a police vehicle, not as an officer, but as someone who would need to answer for his actions. James remained at his post for the remainder of his shift, though his mind was racing. He thought about his family, about his training, about the oath he had taken when he became a Royal Guard. He had done everything right, yet he had been assaulted simply for doing his job. The injustice of it burned inside him, but he kept that fire hidden beneath his stoic exterior. As news of the incident began to spread through the police force and the palace staff, people were shocked and outraged. An assault on a royal guard was not just an attack on an individual. It was an attack on a centuries-old institution and everything it represented. The videos of the incident went viral within hours. By late afternoon, millions of people around the world had watched the footage of Officer Derek Thompson shoving Royal Guard James Mitchell. The comment sections were filled with outrage, with people demanding justice and praising James for his incredible self-control in the face of such unprovoked aggression. Back at the police station, Derek sat in an interrogation room, his head in his hands. His uniform felt heavy on his shoulders, though he knew he might not be wearing it for much longer. The Internal Affairs Division had already been called in to investigate the incident. His career, which he had worked so hard to build over the past 12 years, was now hanging by a thread. Detective Inspector Sarah Collins entered the room and sat down across from Derek. She had known him for years, had worked alongside him on various cases, and had always respected him as a competent officer. Seeing him in this situation was difficult for her, but her duty was clear. She needed to get his statement and understand what had led to such a serious breach of conduct. Derek looked up at her with red, swollen eyes. He had been crying, something Sarah had never seen from him before. He tried to explain himself, talking about the stress he had been under. The problems in his marriage, the feeling of being overlooked and undervalued at work. Sarah listened without interruption, taking notes as he spoke. When he finished, Sarah leaned back in her chair and sighed. She explained to him that while she understood he was going through a difficult time, nothing he had said could excuse what he had done. He had assaulted someone while on duty, in full uniform, in front of witnesses. The fact that the victim was a royal guard made the situation even more serious. Derek nodded slowly. He knew she was right. There was no excuse, no justification for his actions. He had let his emotions control him, and now he would have to face the consequences. He asked Sarah what would happen next, though he already suspected the answer. Sarah explained the process. He would be suspended immediately pending the outcome of the investigation. Given the clear video evidence and multiple witnesses, the investigation would likely be concluded quickly. He would face disciplinary action from the police force, which could include dismissal. Beyond that, he could potentially face criminal charges for assault. The words hit Derek like physical blows. Dismissal meant losing his pension, his career, everything he had worked for. Criminal charges could mean a prison sentence. His life was unraveling before his eyes. It's all because of a few seconds of poor judgment fueled by anger and frustration. Meanwhile, the palace, James had finally finished his shift. He was called into a meeting with his commanding officer, Captain Richard Thornton. Richard was a stern but fair man who had served as a royal guard. Himself for many years before moving into a leadership position, Richard asked James to recount what had happened. James described the incident in detail, his voice steady, despite the emotion he felt inside. Richard listened carefully, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When James finished, Richard stood and placed a hand on the young guard's shoulder. Richard told James that he had conducted himself perfectly. He had maintained his composure, followed protocol, and represented the royal guard with honor and dignity. The captain assured him that the palace took the incident very seriously and would be supporting him fully. He also informed James that he would likely need to provide a formal statement to the police and potentially testify if the case went to court. James nodded his understanding. He had known that would be required, but hearing it made the situation feel even more real. He asked Richard if he could take a few days off to process what had happened. Richard agreed immediately, telling James to take all the time he needed. As James left the palace that evening, still in his civilian clothes, he was approached by several reporters who had been waiting outside. They shouted questions at him, asking how he felt, whether he wanted Derek to be prosecuted, what message he had for other guards. James politely declined to comment and hurried to his car. The drive home gave James time to think. He thought about Derek, wondering what had been going through the police officer's mind. He thought about his own reaction, or rather his lack of reaction. Part of him wished he had been able to defend himself, to push back, but he knew that would have been wrong. He had done his duty, and he had to find peace in that. At home, James's wife Emma was waiting for him. She had seen the videos online and had been worried sick. When James walked through the door, she rushed to embrace him. He held her tightly. Finally allowing himself to show the emotion he had been holding back all day, Emma made tea, and they sat together on the couch. James told her everything, from the moment Derek first approached him to the meeting with Captain Thornton. Emma listened, her hand in his, occasionally squeezing it to show her support. She told James how proud she was of him, how his restraint and professionalism in such a difficult situation showed the kind of man he was. But she also expressed her worry. What if Derek came back? What if there were others who might target James now that his face was all over the internet? James reassured her that security at the palace was excellent, and that the incident had prompted a review of protocols to ensure better protection for the guards. But privately, he shared some of her concerns. The world could be unpredictable, and anger could make people do terrible things. As Derek had demonstrated that night, James had trouble sleeping. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Derek's face, twisted with anger, coming toward him. He replayed the moment over and over, wondering if there was anything he could have done differently, even though logically he knew he had handled it correctly. 3 days after the incident, James received a phone call that would change everything. The caller identified himself as Marcus Thompson, Derek's younger brother. James's first instinct was to hang up, but something in Marcus's voice made him pause. There was no anger there, no hostility, only a deep sadness that resonated through the phone line. Marcus apologized profusely for his brother's actions. He explained that he had seen the videos, that everyone in their family had seen them. Now they were all devastated by what Derek had done. Marcus asked if James would be willing to meet with him, not with Derek, just with him, so he could apologize in person and try to explain some context about what his brother had been going through. James was hesitant. Meeting with the family of the man who had assaulted him seemed like a bad idea, but something about Marcus's sincerity touched him. Against his better judgment, James agreed to meet at a small cafe far from the palace, somewhere quiet where they could talk privately. When James arrived at the cafe the next afternoon, he spotted Marcus immediately. The family resemblance was strong. Marcus stood up as James approached, extending his hand nervously. James shook it, and they both sat down, ordering coffee before beginning their conversation. Marcus started by apologizing again. He explained that Derek had always been the responsible one in their family, the one who had helped raise Marcus after their father died when they were young. Derek had been a good police officer, respected by his colleagues, someone who genuinely wanted to help people. But in recent months, something had changed. Derek's marriage had been deteriorating for over a year. His wife had been having an affair, though Derek had only found out about it a few weeks before the incident at the palace. The revelation had crushed him. On top of that, he had been working long hours, dealing with increasingly difficult cases, and feeling undervalued by his superiors, who kept passing him over for promotion. Marcus emphasized that none of this excused what Derek had done. He was not making excuses, just trying to help James understand that his brother was not a monster, but rather a good man who had made a terrible mistake during the worst period of his life. Marcus's eyes filled with tears as he spoke about how ashamed Derek was, how he had barely left his apartment since the incident, how he had been contemplating ending his own life. This last piece of information shocked James. He had been so focused on his own feelings, on the injustice of what had been done to him, that he had not really considered what Derek might be going through now. The viral videos, the public shaming, the loss of his career, the potential criminal charges. All of it together must have been overwhelming. Marcus pulled out his phone and showed James some messages Derek had sent him. They were dark, expressing deep regret and self-hatred. Derek had written that he did not deserve to live, that he had destroyed everything good in his life, that James and the world would be better off without him. Marcus was genuinely frightened for his brother's safety. James sat back in his chair, processing this new information. Part of him felt vindicated, believing that Derek should face consequences for his actions. But another part of him, the part that made him a good person, felt compassion for a man who was clearly suffering, even if that suffering was partially self-inflicted. Marcus asked James if he would consider meeting with Derek, not to forgive him necessarily, but just to let Derek apologize directly. Marcus believed that if Derek could face James, acknowledge what he had done, and receive some kind of response, it might help him begin to heal. Without that closure, Marcus feared his brother might do something drastic. James took a long drink of his coffee, buying time to think. This was a huge request. Why should he do anything to help the man who had assaulted him? He had every right to refuse. Let Derek deal with the consequences of his actions without any assistance from the victim. But as James looked at Marcus, saw the desperation and love he had for his brother, he thought about his own family. He thought about Emma, about how she would feel if he were in Derek's position. He thought about the kind of person he wanted to be, not just as a royal guard, but as a human being. After a long silence, James agreed to meet with Derek, but with conditions. The meeting would take place in a neutral location with Marcus as present. Derek would not touch him or come too close. James made it clear that he was not promising forgiveness, but he was willing to listen to what Derek had to say. Marcus's relief was visible. He thanked James repeatedly, his voice cracking with emotion. They exchanged phone numbers and agreed to arrange the meeting for later that week. As they left the cafe, Marcus shook James's hand again. This time, holding it with both of his hands, his eyes conveying gratitude that words could not fully express. Over the next few days, James thought constantly about the upcoming meeting. Emma was concerned, worried that it might be dangerous, or that it might reopen emotional wounds that were just beginning to heal. But James assured her that he needed to do this, not just for Derek, but for himself. He needed to look the man in the eye and understand why he had done what he did. James also spoke with Captain Thornton about the planned meeting. The captain was surprised but respected James's decision. He advised James to be careful and to remember that he was under no obligation to forgive or show mercy. Whatever James decided to do, the palace would support him. The day of the meeting arrived. It was set for a Sunday afternoon at a community center in a quiet neighborhood. Marcus had arranged for them to use a small meeting room where they would have privacy. James arrived early, his heart pounding with nervousness. He was not sure what to expect or how he would react when he saw Derek again. Marcus greeted him at the entrance, led him to the room. Derek was already there, sitting at a table with his hands folded in front of him. When James entered, Derek stood up instinctively, but then stopped himself, remembering the boundaries James had set. He looked terrible, like he had not slept properly in days. With dark circles under his eyes and a gaunt appearance that suggested he had not been eating well either, the three men sat down at the table, an uncomfortable silence filling the room. Derek stared at his hands, unable to meet James's eyes. Marcus looked between them, clearly nervous about how this would unfold. Finally, James spoke, his voice calm but firm, asking Derek to explain himself. Derek took a shaky breath and began to speak. His voice was rough, as if he had been crying recently. He started by offering a sincere apology, acknowledging that nothing he could say would undo what he had done or fully excuse his behavior. He looked up at James for the first time, and James could see genuine remorse in his eyes. Derek explained what had been happening in his life, much of which Marcus had already shared with James, but hearing it directly from Derek made it more real. He talked about finding out about his wife's affair, about feeling like a failure both at home and at work. He described the morning of the incident, how he had been walking past the palace in a fog of anger and pain, looking for something or someone to blame for all his problems. When he saw James standing there, so composed and disciplined, something in Derek had snapped. He had projected all his frustrations onto this stranger who represented everything Derek felt he was not: controlled, respected, dignified. The assault had not been about James at all, Derek explained. It had been about Derek's own failings, his own loss of control, his own self-hatred turned outward. Derek's voice broke as he continued. He talked about the aftermath, about losing his job, about the public humiliation, about lying awake at night thinking about the moment over and over again. But what haunted him most was not what he had lost, but what he had done to James. He had attacked an innocent person who was simply doing his job. He had violated the trust placed in him as a police officer. He had betrayed everything he had once stood for. James listened without interrupting, watching Derek carefully. He could see that this was not an act. The remorse was genuine. The pain was real. Derek was a broken man, crushed under the weight of his own mistakes. Part of James felt satisfaction at seeing his attacker suffer, but a larger part felt only sadness at witnessing another human being in such torment. When Derek finished speaking, he asked James what he could possibly do to make things right. His voice was desperate, searching for some kind of path forward, some way to earn redemption. James sat quietly for a moment, considering his response carefully. James told Derek that there was nothing he could do to change what had happened. The assault had occurred, it had been recorded, and it would always be part of both their histories. But James also acknowledged that he could see Derek was genuinely sorry, and that meant something. He explained that holding on to anger would only hurt himself, and that while he might never fully forget what happened, he was willing to try to forgive. Derek's eyes widened in disbelief. He asked James why he would show such kindness to someone who had hurt him. James thought about the question and explained that forgiveness was not about excusing the behavior or saying it was acceptable. It was about releasing the burden of hatred and allowing both of them to move forward with their lives. Carrion? Anger forever would make James a prisoner to this one moment, and he refused to let Derek's mistake define the rest of his life. Marcus, who had been quietly watching the exchange, wiped tears from his eyes. He had hoped for a civil conversation, but had not dared to dream that James would offer forgiveness. Derek sat frozen, overwhelmed by emotion. He tried to speak several times but could not find words adequate to express his gratitude and continued remorse. James continued, explaining that forgiveness did not mean there should not be consequences. Derek would still have to face whatever legal or professional repercussions came his way, and James would not interfere with that process. But on a personal level, James was choosing to let go of his anger and wish Derek the best in rebuilding his life. Derek finally managed to speak, thanking James through tears. He promised that he would spend the rest of his life trying to become worthy of the mercy James had shown him. He talked about getting therapy, about working on himself, about eventually finding a way to help others so that some good could come from this terrible situation. The three men talked for another hour, the conversation gradually becoming less tense and more open. Derek asked James about his life, his family, his work as a royal guard. James shared some stories, and even Derek managed to smile a few times. As the weight of guilt lifted slightly from his shoulders, before they parted, James had one final thing to say. He told Derek that what had happened was also a reminder to himself about the importance of compassion and understanding. It was easy to judge people based on their worst moments, but everyone was fighting battles that others could not see. James said he hoped they could both learn from this experience and become better people because of it. They stood and shook hands, a gesture that felt significant given how their last physical interaction had gone. Marcus embraced his brother, relief evident in his face. As James prepared to leave, Derek asked if they might stay in touch, not as friends necessarily, but just so Derek could update James on his progress and continue to make amends through his actions over time. James agreed, giving Derek his phone number. He warned Derek that rebuilding trust would take time and consistent effort, but he was willing to give him that opportunity. As James walked out of the community center that afternoon, he felt lighter than he had in days, or the anger and violation he had been carrying had been replaced by a sense of peace. When James got home, Emma immediately asked how it went. James told her everything, and she listened with amazement. She admitted that she was not sure she could have been as forgiving in his position, but she was proud of him for taking the higher road. They talked long into the evening about forgiveness, accountability, and the complexity of human nature. That night, James slept better than he had since the incident. He had faced his attacker, heard his apology, and chosen to forgive. It was not about Derek deserving forgiveness, but about James deserving peace. He had taken control of his own emotional well-being and refused to be defined by the worst moment of someone else's life. The weeks following the meeting brought unexpected developments. The story of James's forgiveness began to spread. It's not as viral videos this time, but through news articles and social media posts from people who had heard about the private meeting. Marcus had shared the story with close friends, who then shared it with others. And soon the narrative shifted from one of assault and anger to one of redemption and compassion. Derek was still facing the legal consequences of his actions. The Crown Prosecution Service had decided to press charges for assault, and Derek had pleaded guilty at his first court appearance. His honesty about what he had done and his genuine remorse were noted by the judge, but there would still be a sentencing hearing to determine his punishment. James received a call from Derek's solicitor, asking if he would be willing to provide a victim impact statement. Such statements typically describe the harm caused by the crime and often argue for harsher sentences. But James's statement was different. He described the incident and its immediate impact honestly, including the shock and violation he had felt. However, he also wrote about meeting with Derek, about recognizing his genuine remorse, and about his belief that Derek could still be a positive contributor to society, given the chance to rehabilitate himself. The solicitor was surprised by the statement's tone but gratified. She told James that such a statement from the victim could significantly influence the judge's sentencing decision. James made it clear that he was not asking for Derek to escape consequences, only that those consequences be proportionate and focused on rehabilitation rather than pure punishment. In the meantime, Derek had been working on himself. He had started seeing a therapist twice a week to deal with his anger issues and the underlying depression that had contributed to his breakdown. He had also begun volunteering at a local youth center, working with troubled teenagers and sharing his own story as a cautionary tale about what happens when you let anger control your actions. Derek stayed in regular contact with James, sending him updates every few weeks. He was careful not to be intrusive or to expect James to respond every time, but he wanted James to see that he was serious about changing his life. James would occasionally reply with words of encouragement, their messages gradually becoming more comfortable and less formal. One of Derek's messages contained surprising news. He had been contacted by a charity organization that worked with at-risk youth and former offenders. They had heard his story and were impressed by his efforts to rehabilitate himself. They offered him a position as a counselor, working with young people who were in danger of making similar mistakes to the one Derek had made. The job would start after his court case was resolved, assuming he did not receive a custodial sentence. Derek was excited but also nervous. He asked James for advice about whether he should take the job. James responded thoughtfully, saying that it sounded like an excellent opportunity for Derek to turn his worst moment into something meaningful. He encouraged Derek to pursue it and to use his experience to help others avoid the same path. The day of Derek's sentencing hearing arrived. James attended the court, sitting in the public gallery. When Derek entered the courtroom, he looked different than he had at their first meeting after the incident. He stood straighter, his eyes were clearer, and there was a sense of purpose about him that had been absent before. When Derek spotted James in the gallery, he nodded respectfully, and James nodded back. The prosecutor outlined the facts of the case, including the video evidence and witness statements. The assault was described as unprovoked and serious, especially given that Derek had been a serving police officer at the time. The prosecutor argued for a sentence that would reflect the seriousness of the offense and serve as a deterrent to others. Then Derek's solicitor stood to present the defense. She acknowledged the seriousness of what Derek had done, but asked the court to consider the context and, more importantly, what Derek had done since the incident. She presented evidence of his therapy sessions, his volunteer work, the job offer from the charity, and the letters of support from his therapist, his brother. and community members who had witnessed his transformation. Finally, she read James's victim impact statement. The courtroom fell silent as the words were spoken. James described his initial anger and fear, but also his decision to meet with Derek, his recognition of Derek's genuine remorse, and his belief that Derek deserved a chance to redeem himself through positive action rather than being destroyed by punishment alone. The judge listened carefully to everything that was presented. When it came time for sentencing, she addressed Derek directly. She acknowledged the seriousness of his offense and made it clear that assaulting anyone, particularly while serving as a police officer, was completely unacceptable. However, she also noted his guilty plea, his genuine remorse, the exceptional victim impact statement, and the significant efforts he had made toward rehabilitation. The judge sentenced Derek to 12 months in prison, suspended for 2 years. This meant that Derek would not go to prison immediately, but would face imprisonment if he committed any further offenses during that 2-year period. Additionally, he was ordered to complete 200 hours of community service and to continue with his therapy sessions. He was also given a restraining order that prevented him from going near Buckingham Palace or contacting James unless James initiated the contact. Derek accepted the sentence with visible relief and gratitude. As he left the courtroom, he looked up at James once more and mouthed the words, "Thank you." James simply nodded. He felt that justice had been served, not through revenge, but through a balanced approach that held Derek accountable while also giving him the opportunity to rebuild his life. Outside the courthouse, James was approached by several reporters asking for his reaction to the sentence. He gave a brief statement saying that he believed the judge had made a fair decision and that he hoped Derek would use this second chance to make a positive difference in the world. He declined to answer further questions and walked away to where Emma was waiting for him. That evening, James received a text message from Derek. It was short but heartfelt, expressing gratitude not just for the victim impact statement, but for the second chance at life that James's forgiveness had made possible. Derek promised to honor that gift by dedicating himself to helping others avoid the mistakes he had made. James showed the message to Emma. They talked about how strange and unpredictable life could be. A few months ago, Derek had been James's attacker, someone who had violated his sense of safety and dignity. Now, they were not exactly friends, but they were connected by a shared experience that had transformed both of them in unexpected ways. In the following weeks, James returned to his duties at the palace. His fellow guards treated him with even more respect than before. Impressed by both his composure during the assault and his grace in the aftermath, Captain Thornton told James that he was being considered for a commendation for his exemplary conduct and for the positive way he had represented the Royal Guard. Throughout the entire ordeal, 6 months after the sentencing, James's life had returned to a comfortable routine. He continued his work as a Royal Guard, and the incident had become part of his past rather than something that dominated his present. He and Emma had grown even closer through the experience, their relationship strengthened. By having navigated such a difficult situation together, Derek had also moved forward with his life. He had completed most of his community service hours, working at homeless shelters and food banks across London. His therapy sessions were going well, and he had learned healthy ways to manage stress and anger. Most importantly, he had started his new job with the youth charity organization. Derek's work involved meeting with teenagers who had been identified as at risk of becoming involved in crime or violence. He would sit with them, sometimes one-on-one, and sometimes in groups, and share his story. He told them about his successful career as a police officer, about the personal problems that had overwhelmed him, and about the moment when he had lost control and made a decision that had nearly destroyed his life. The young people he worked with could see that. Derek was speaking from genuine experience. He was not some authority figure lecturing them from a position of moral superiority. He was someone who had fallen, who had made terrible mistakes, and who was working hard to climb back up. His authenticity made his message powerful, and many of the teenagers he worked with began to open up about their own struggles. One afternoon, Derek was giving a presentation at a secondary school in East London. After he finished speaking, a 15-year-old boy named Tyler approached him. Tyler had a reputation as a troublemaker, someone who was constantly getting into fights and defying authority. He told Derek that the story had made him think about his own anger issues and asked for advice. Derek spent an hour talking with Tyler, sharing the techniques his therapist had taught him for managing anger and stress. He gave Tyler his contact information and told him he could reach out anytime he needed to talk. Over the following months, Derek and Tyler developed a mentoring relationship. Tyler's behavior at school began to improve dramatically. He started thinking about his future in ways he never had before. Stories like Tyler's became more common as Derek continued his work. His supervisor at the charity told him that he was making a real difference in these young people's lives, that his willingness to be vulnerable and honest about his own failures was more effective than anything they had tried before. Derek felt, for the first time since the incident, that his life had purpose and meaning again. James heard about Derek's success through Marcus, who occasionally sent him updates. James felt a sense of satisfaction knowing that his decision to forgive had contributed to Derek's transformation and, by extension, to the positive impact Derek was now having on others. It reinforced James's belief that forgiveness, while difficult, could create ripples of positive change that extended far beyond the original act. One day, James received an unexpected invitation. The charity organization where Derek worked was holding a fundraising gala, and they wanted to honor both Derek and James for their role in what they were calling a story of redemption and forgiveness. They asked if James would be willing to attend and perhaps say a few words about his experience. James discussed the invitation with Emma. Part of him wanted to decline, to leave the past in the past. But another part of him recognized that sharing their story might inspire others to choose forgiveness over vengeance, understanding over judgment. After thinking it over, he accepted the invitation. The gala was held at a beautiful venue in central London. James arrived with Emma, both dressed formally for the occasion. They were greeted warmly by the charity's director, who thanked them profusely for coming and for being part of such an inspiring story. As James entered the main hall, he saw Derek across the room talking with some of the young people he had been mentoring. Derek looked healthy and confident, completely different from the broken man James had met in that community center months ago. When Derek spotted James, he excused himself from his conversation and walked over. The two men shook hands, and this time it felt natural and comfortable. Derek introduced James to several of the teenagers he had been working with, including Tyler. The young people were excited to meet the royal guard from the story they had heard so many times. Tyler told James that Derek's story had changed his life, that he was now planning to finish school and maybe even join the police force himself one day. During dinner, James sat at a table with Derek, Marcus, Emma, and several charity staff members. The conversation flowed easily, with laughter and warmth replacing the tension that had marked their earlier interactions. Derek talked about the young people he was working with, his eyes lighting up as he described their progress and achievements. James shared some lighthearted stories from his work at the palace, carefully avoiding anything that might be considered confidential. After dinner, the charity director took the stage and introduced the evening's program. She spoke about the organization's mission and the challenges facing young people in London today. Then she began to tell the story of James and Derek, explaining how a moment of violence had been transformed into a story of hope through the power of forgiveness and the determination to change. Derek was called to the stage first. He stood before the crowd of donors, volunteers, and young people, his hands gripping the podium. He spoke about his fall from grace, about the assault, and about the darkness that had consumed him afterward. He talked about meeting James and receiving forgiveness he did not deserve. His voice was steady but emotional as he described how that forgiveness had given him the strength to rebuild his life and find a new purpose in helping others. Derek explained that every day he worked with these young people, he thought about James and the mercy he had been shown. It motivated him to be better, to do better, and to pass on the gift of second chances to others who needed them. He concluded by thanking James publicly, his voice cracking with emotion as he acknowledged the debt he could never fully repay. The audience applauded as Derek returned to his seat. Then it was James's turn. He walked to the stage feeling nervous, unused to speaking in front of large crowds. He looked out at the audience and took a deep breath before beginning. James spoke about his initial reaction to the assault, the anger and confusion he had felt. He talked about his decision to meet with Derek and how difficult that choice had been. But he also explained that forgiveness had not been about Derek at all, at least not initially. It had been about James refusing to carry the burden of hatred and anger for the rest of his life. He told the audience that seeing what Derek had done with his second chance had validated his decision to forgive. Derek was now helping young people avoid the mistakes he had made, creating positive change in the world. James said that this was what forgiveness could accomplish when it was met with genuine remorse and a commitment to change. James concluded by saying that everyone makes mistakes, some bigger than others, but what defines us is not our worst moment, but how we respond to our failures. He encouraged the audience to consider showing mercy when possible, not because people always deserve it, but because it has the power to break cycles of hurt and create opportunities for redemption. The applause that followed was thunderous. People stood from their seats, moved by the sincerity and wisdom of James's words. Emma wiped tears from her eyes, proud of her husband's courage in sharing such a personal story. Marcus embraced his brother, grateful that the nightmare they had lived through had somehow transformed into this beautiful moment. After the speeches, several people approached James to thank him and share their own stories of forgiveness, or the need for it. One elderly woman told him about forgiving the drunk driver who had killed her son, and how that forgiveness had saved her from being consumed by bitterness. A young man talked about forgiving his abusive father and finally finding peace. Each story reinforced for James that he and Derek were not alone in experiencing the healing power of forgiveness. As the evening wound down, Derek asked James if they could talk privately for a moment. They stepped out onto a quiet terrace overlooking the city. Derek turned to James, his expression serious but peaceful. Derek told James that he had something he wanted to say, something he had been thinking about for months. He explained that James's forgiveness had literally saved his life. On the day before Marcus had convinced him to reach out to James, Derek had been planning to end his life. He had felt that there was no way forward, no possibility of redemption. But the chance to apologize and receive forgiveness had given him hope when he had none left. James was stunned by this revelation. He had not realized how close Derek had been to the edge. Derek continued, saying that every life he touched through his work, every young person he helped, every positive change he made in the world, was possible because James had chosen mercy over revenge. Derek wanted James to know that the impact of his forgiveness extended far beyond their personal relationship. James did not know what to say. He had thought of his forgiveness as a personal choice, something that affected just him and Derek. He had not considered the ripple effect, how Derek's transformation was now touching dozens of other lives, which would in turn touch hundreds more over time. The responsibility of that realization was overwhelming, but also deeply moving. The two men stood in comfortable silence for a while, looking out over the city lights. Finally, James spoke. He told Derek that he was proud of him, proud of the work he was doing and the man he had become. Those words meant everything to Derek, coming from the person he had wronged so terribly. They returned to the party together, no longer as victim and attacker, but as two men connected by a shared experience that had changed both their lives. When the evening ended and James and Emma prepared to leave, Derek walked them to their car. He shook James's hand one final time, holding it firmly and looking him directly in the eye. Derek told James that he would continue to work hard every day to be worthy of the second chance he had been given. James replied that Derek had already proven himself worthy, that he should now focus on helping others find their own paths to redemption. They parted as friends, each heading home to the lives they had rebuilt from the ashes of that terrible day outside Buckingham Palace. As James drove home with Emma beside him, reflected on the journey that had begun with violence and anger, but had somehow led to healing and hope. He thought about the choice he had made to forgive, and how that single decision had created a cascade of positive changes he could never have predicted. James realized that this was the true power of forgiveness. It was not just about releasing anger or moving past hurt. It was about creating space for transformation, for growth, the possibility that people could change, and that their worst moments did not have to define them forever. The story of Royal Guard James Mitchell and former police officer Derek Thompson became known throughout London and beyond. It was shared in schools, in churches, in therapy sessions, and in homes where people were struggling with their own need to forgive or be forgiven. Their story reminded people that even in our darkest moments, there is always the possibility of redemption, always the chance for a new beginning, and always the power of forgiveness to transform lives in ways we cannot imagine.